I wonder, to what extent do you think that this more of a friendliness towards Russia and at the same time a much less friendly attitude towards Europe, to what extent is that just Trump and the people he brought with him into this administration? And to what extent it's some more fundamental shift in the United States or in the Republican Party that we in Europe haven't noticed before? And to what extent we may be looking at it from Europe, we should expect that when Trump is gone, this will go back to normal, or whether this is something that will linger on long after Trump is gone and a new generation of Republican politicians will come after him.
So this is something of a chicken and egg problem. In other words, the fact that we have in the White House and in the administration a group of people who are instinctively pro-Russian, who are instinctively anti-European, both against the European Union, but also suspicious of European leaders and European democracy, which they see as a kind of ideological challenge, as sort of ideological enemies rather than friends. That influences their voters and their followers. The things that they say and the interviews that they give and the propagandists who around them who take clues from what they say and who then appear on podcasts or on X or on other forms of social media. I mean, they have created a dislike and suspicion of Europe that I'm not sure if it was there before, it wasn't quite so strong. So yeah, I do think that they are now a permanent presence in U.S. politics. There is a part of U.S. society that now feels very alienated from Europe, that doesn't want allies, that sees the alliances as a burden, that doesn't feel any instinctive link to other democracies or cares about other democracies. I would say this is still a minority. It's funny, actually, just this afternoon for something that I'm writing, I was looking up the numbers, and actually the clear majority of Americans still support American membership of NATO and still see Europeans as our closest allies and still feel affinity for other democracies, not just in Europe, I should say, but around the world, and still want America to play a role on the world stage as a leader of the democracy. So actually there is a majority support for that. It's depending on how you ask the question, it's kind of 60, 70%. I mean, it's quite a high and clear majority. But the numbers who agree to that in the Republican Party among people who are registered Republicans has dropped. And so this is, and the Republican Party is one of our two political parties, and they will always have influence, and sometimes they'll be in control of Congress or the White House. And so I think it's now a permanent piece of American foreign policy, at least, until there's another shift or change or events that reshape that. But right now, yeah, I think it's something that I think European leaders have to take that. It's a little bit more than skepticism. It's actually a kind of anti-European sentiment and feeling that exists in a part of the Republican Party. I think that's now probably permanent.
Why do you think, or where do you think that is actually coming from? Because I think as a European, it's something that you clearly notice, but it's very confusing, and I'm never sure to what extent, because it aligns quite well with the way portrayal of the world as the Russian propaganda or Russians portray it, and a lot of people who you said were instinctively pro-Russian seem to accept and adopt this worldview. But why is it so popular? Is it just that it came at a time when the West is so politically divided that it was particularly vulnerable to it?
So first of all, once again, it's not the majority. The majority, are of Americans, and I would say the majority of American politicians, absolutely clear majorities in the Senate, for example, and Congress are pro-European or pro the alliance is a better way to put it. But there has been a development over the last decade, and I do think Russia played a role in it. So there is a role played by Russian propaganda, by people in the US who, for various reasons, liked or admired or adopted Russian propaganda or used parts of it in their own development of their own ideology or their own way of seeing the world. there's a kind of co-creation. I mean, it's not the case that clever Russians manipulated Americans. I mean, I think actually sometimes the influence goes the other way. I think this kind of, for example, the right wing critique of so-called woke culture. I think Putin got that from the U.S. Because woke isn't a thing in Russia, or actually really almost anywhere in Central Europe. It's a thing that he learned about from reading the work of the American far right, and so and then Putin himself began to say this. He's made comments about arguments about transgenderism that he's seen on American social media and so on. So in a way, this is they worked jointly together. I mean, in a way, I have written about this before. There's a strange and almost eerie parallel between the relationship of the American far right and Russia and the American far left in the middle of the 20th century and the Soviet Union, in that in both cases there are Americans, many of whom have never been to Russia, know very little about Russia, who admire Russia as some kind of alternative to their own society. They don't like their own society. So the left didn't like capitalist America in the old days. The far right dislikes diverse America. Or this is I'm using this is a shortcut. I mean, of course, it's more complicated than that. And they therefore see in Russia some kind of alternative ideal. And Russia is sufficiently far away and sufficiently unknown so that they can make Russia into a kind of ideal that they don't have. And this is exactly what the far left, the American communists, did about the Soviet Union. They imagined it to be some kind of workers' paradise, where happy peasants produced lots of grain. They saw the Soviet posters and propaganda, and they believed that was true, and they wanted something like that for the United States. And so you now have the phenomenon of the far right imagining that Russia this is their language, is a white Christian nation that doesn't allow, all these modern things like feminism. I mean, if you know anything about Russia, you know that it's actually a multilingual, multicultural nation, far more so than the United States. There are parts of there are the sort of the republics inside Russia, which are run by equivalents of Sharia law. That's what Chechnya is run by. It's partially Sharia. There are people speak many languages there. People have many different colors, skin. There is no single religion in Russia, and even those who are Christians very rarely go to church, and almost nobody in Russia has ever read a Bible. In addition to which, there is repression of Protestant groups in Russia, including some that have a lot of following inside the United States. So the idea that it's somehow a great place for white Protestants is a myth. But it's a myth that a part of the American right has taken up, and you can hear them saying it. Goes back to Pat Buchanan, who was a kind of one of the fathers of the original of the modern American far right, was someone who started with this more than a decade ago, and you can hear others saying the same thing. And so, as I say, it's a kind of imaginary. There's an imaginary ideal. They dislike things about their own country so much that they see some kind of alternative somewhere else, and that's been true of the American far right in Russia. And of course, the Russians saw this, understood it, fed it. I mean, there's some instances of Russians paying Americans who produced this kind of propaganda. There was an incident last summer where the American Justice Department revealed that a media group in Tennessee had been receiving money from a mysterious foreign investor with an Armenian surname, who turned out to be Russia Today. I mean, it turned out to be just Russian state media who were paying them to produce videos, some of which were anti-Ukrainian, some of them were about other things. But so in some cases you can see money, in some cases you can see Russian social media campaigns. But I think it's also it's the same thing that motivated the American far left in the past. This imagining that there is some better alternative state and some better alternative leader who we can admire.
If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter. Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I talk about the major threat that Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, is facing, why he's increasingly likely to be defeated in the next year's elections, why his new challenger is not at all who you would expect, and why it might be a lesson for politicians everywhere. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description.